Hey everyone, Gaijin here. Alright, so I know everybody and their mom has been over on Amazon watching Invincible and just memeing the ever-loving crap out of its season finale, but me personally, I've been catching up on Netflix's Yasuke. Now you might have heard of it, or you might not have, but basically, this is a 6-episode series that kind of loosely talks about Yasuke's past and his theoretical future, with Yasuke being basically one of, if not the only, African samurai to ever exist in Japan. And honestly, I've been absolutely dying to see this particular anime, because it wasn't that long ago that back over on my other channel, I did a completely comprehensive video talking about not only Yasuke, but other African and African-American samurai, whether they be in real life or fiction. And so I've been really curious whether or not this particular anime just does a stellar job at really representing Yasuke for who he was in history, or completely cocking it up terribly. But the thing that I don't think a lot of people are really talking about when it comes to Yasuke is that there are so many little points of brilliance within this anime, despite a lot of negative things, that it's not being really talked about that much, at least from a historical perspective. And I really wanted to talk about these particular things and just kind of get that out there. But before I get into this historical stuff that made me squeal like a little girl, I really want to put my perspective out on a whole when it comes to this particular series, because this might not be for everyone. So let's talk about the good. The first thing that I saw in this particular show, and that I think a lot of people would really gravitate towards, is that there's this hybridization of like feudalistic Japan and like mecha space future. Personally, that's two things that I absolutely love just kind of smashed into each other, and I guess the best example I can give, if I was to compare it with another show, would be Samurai 7, which is like this future tech take on the Seven Samurai, you know, Kurosawa's film, and it's one of my favorite anime of all time, so as soon as I saw it, I just lost it. And what's even better is that where Samurai 7 just kind of takes this futuristic aesthetic and just makes it kind of a backdrop, freaking Yasuke just goes all in bonkers with it. So like the very opening of the very first episode of this series, right? It starts off with this pan that's going down into this really like tight and kind of complex, it looks like a city almost, right? And there's regular samurai, yeah, that are just, you know, they're throwing their swords around, they're stabbing their spears around, but then you see this giant mecha-suited samurai just kind of come out of the woodwork, and like one arm is just this one big long katana blade, and the other is like this big flintlock cannon where they take the sword and they have to scrape against it to create sparks and then shoot something. It's such a beautiful hybrid. I absolutely love it. And it's not just like big mecha and high technology that gets wormed into this series' world. You've got magic of all things. I mean, I don't know what else to call it. You've got these omyochi who are throwing up these like ofura, which are kind of going up and they glow into these big webs, and then all these soldiers are shooting arrows into it, and those arrows are turning into lasers, and it's just slamming down on everything, and it's so visually cool. And then all of a sudden, you've got this multi-story mecha just slicing this temple right in half out of nowhere. And then you're introduced to this like dark general guy who uses like wibbly-wobbly like purple evil magic to like pull up the souls of dead comrades, and then uses that as some kind of big evil buffing juice that he just puts into his other warriors in order to attack more efficiently and stronger and faster. And it's just like, there is so much high fantasy going on here that I just cannot help but be enamored by it. I do have to say this. The highlight of this anime, in my opinion, is that you have a Russian werebear, a Central African stand user right out of JoJo, you have a sickle-wielding woman straight out of a Shin Megami Tensei game, and then imagine Baymax, but if he was loaded down with a bunch of weapons and was really okay with murder. That is what this anime is. That is what the backdrop of this anime is. It's just wild. I mean, it's produced by MAPPA of all people, so, you know, what else do you expect? But what's more than that is some of the more subtle things. Like, similar to Afro Samurai, there's this sort of cultural foundation when it comes to Yasuke, not only as a character, but also his theming. With some of the greatest examples basically being the music that accompanies him, his fight styles, and if at the very first scene where you actually see him introduced to Oda Nobunaga, you know what I'm talking about. Can't show footage here, but if you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now here's the bad when it comes to this series, and I really think it boils down to one thing: pacing. This is a huge sort of epic story that's trying to be told here, and they only have 6 episodes to do it in, where most series will have somewhere between 12 and 24, or even span onto multiple seasons. And so because of that, it feels like so much of it gets rushed. A lot of the atmosphere gets rushed, a lot of the characters get rushed. Like, as I said before, there's this super melding of, like, ancient Japan and futuristic, like, mecha Japan. But the problem is that unlike Samurai 7, like I mentioned earlier, like, Yasuke introduces a handful of futuristic things, such as, like, hyper fantasy Omyo and then, like, hyper mecha samurai, but that future aesthetic is not really cooked into the world. Where in Samurai 7, everyone has some sort of augmentation, or maybe it's somehow how they're dressed. The cities reflect it, vehicles reflect it, everything reflects it. But in this, it's like you get this glimpse of what the show could have been in terms of its futuristic take on feudal Japan, but then it spends so much time of the series essentially in feudal Japan that when you see this robot roll in, you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's right, there are robots in this show. And all those crazy characters that I talked about before, the Russian werebear and the Central African stand user and whatnot, they just feel really out of place. They don't really feel integrated into the world. It's like there's regular Japan in the late 1500s, and then there's all this hyper, like, stylized fantasy stuff that's just kind of getting thrown into it. And then you've got Saki. Oh my gosh, I hate this girl. Like, she's fine, it's just, she's a chosen one. This entire story is basically protecting the chosen one, and the pace is just way too fast for her to develop. She just does magical things for whatever reason. I mean, it's weird too, because Saki will get sick, and then she's not sick, and then she can't control her powers, and now she can. It's just a mess, and it's a pacing issue. So despite how I may personally feel about this anime, love it or hate it, and it does have some problems, do I still like it? And the answer is absolutely yes. Because despite the fact that there is magic and mayhem, samurai mechs, and futuristic onmyoji, and nothing really seems to make sense and the pacing is all out of whack, this anime sends out some really, really heartfelt sort of shoutouts to not only Yasuke's history, but Nobunaga's history and the history of the times. And I get the feeling that it's going to get overlooked a whole lot, so that's what I really wanted to break down in this video. So, spoilers, I guess? But I'm not really going to be spoiling much of the plot as it is, it's more of the flashback stuff, and I tell you what, this is information that's been around for the last 400 years, so if you want to get mad at me for spoilers, you need to get mad at every single history textbook that ever talked about the Sengoku Jidai, alright? And speaking of historical documents, I'm going to be claiming a lot of historical things, but I want you to understand that I'm getting them from about 2 or 3 different sources. The first one is a 1581 report done by Louis Freud, and this is actually corroborated by the Nobunaga Chronicle, the Shinsho Koki. And then there's also the Itada Nikki, which chronicles parts of Yasuke life from the perspective of Matsudaira Idetada, Ieyasu Tokugawa's 4th son. Now what's kind of wild about this particular anime is that the really juicy stuff is actually told in flashback. Basically, the actual story as itself is, 40 years after Nobunaga's passing, and it feels more of a B-plot, and the really juicy A-plot has everything to do with Yasuke's historical background. Everything from Yasuke's introduction to Nobunaga at the very, very beginning, all the way played through to the whole Noji incident, where Nobunaga is under attack by Akechi Mitsuhide, and Yasuke is there to help defend him. All of these things are covered in flashbacks, but again, it's these little tidbits that actually stand out the absolute most when it comes to this anime. Because, I mean, when you actually watch these segments, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, this was just kind of fabricated for dramatic effect or for entertainment, but no, a lot of the things that you see actually did happen, and that's what makes it so amazing. Like in the very, very beginning, when Yasuke defeats a samurai who was threatening a child, and Nobunaga was like, oh man, I really like this guy, and he says, wash him. Tells his servants, wash him. So they strip him naked in quasi-public and just start scrubbing him down, and everyone around him is just amazed. It's like, oh, he's not actually dirty. Nobunaga asks, why isn't he clean? And his subordinates are like, Lord Nobunaga, that's actually the color of his skin. And that sounds like it was ludicrous, that sounds crazy, but that actually happened. When Nobunaga first found Yasuke, he was like, wash that man for me. And they did, and then Nobunaga was like, oh my gosh, his skin's black. Not to mention that Yasuke is like 6.5 feet, maybe 7 feet tall. I mean, in a lot of the historical documents that I mentioned earlier, there's actually talk about how Yasuke was over 6 shaku, or 6 feet high, and as strong as 10 men by Nobunaga's volition. So Yeah, he's pretty interesting. But see, that's the thing when it comes to Nobunaga's interest in Yasuke. It wasn't for some kind of menial thing. It wasn't because, oh, well, this is interesting as like some kind of weird sideshow. Nobunaga saw Yasuke and saw the potential in him. And that's something that's very iconic of Nobunaga, and one of the reasons I like the guy as much as I can, because this whole series talks about how Nobunaga is getting rid of this old way and bringing in the new. Basically, getting rid of all these notions of, like, only men can serve in armies and have high rank, and foreigners can't even possibly integrate in Japanese society, and completely flips it on its head, and it's a really neat message. I just wish the series would go into that a little bit more. Because Nobunaga did not see Yasuke as a slave. He didn't treat him like a slave. He saw him and used him in a junior-senior relationship. Nobunaga gave Yasuke a house, a ton of money, a sword, made him a proper retainer, a level of respect that not a lot of other people, not a lot of other Japanese had at that time. And yeah, just like what happens in this anime, Yasuke was with Nobunaga till the absolute very end during the Honnoji incident. Now, I don't know if Yasuke was Nobunaga's kaishakunin. History is just kind of shaky about what actually happened at Nobunaga's death. There are some people said that he just left, that he burned alive, that he did commit seppuku. But, I mean, the thing is that I could kind of see it. But there's one thing that had always bothered me ever since I heard that this series was going to be a thing. This story's A-plot. Everything I've talked about has been flashback, but the A-plot of this anime takes place, what was it, 20, 40 years? I think it's 20 years after Nobunaga's death. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, well, what actually happened is that when Mitsuhide completed the Honnoji incident and Nobunaga was dead, his retainers were either killed or ran, and Mitsuhide basically took over the shogunate. He did not know what to do with Yasuke. Because Yasuke was such a different individual, he didn't subject him to seppuku or anything like that. He basically gave Yasuke back to the Jesuits and he went back into slavery. That's what makes his story so tragic. So why and how is Yasuke still in Japan 20 years later after Nobunaga's dead in this particular anime? Well, in the 4th episode, there was kind of this hand-wavy explanation, but it still kind of makes sense. A particular character says, "I heard you've been captured by the Akechi, that they returned you to the Jesuits, but since you escaped from that bondage, there's not been even a whisper of you." I guess that's fine, that's a little bit of historical revisionism, but you wouldn't have this anime if this didn't happen. And that's all I can really say about the series without dumping a whole bunch of spoilers into it, but that doesn't mean that that's all that there is to talk about. There are actually a lot of historical things that I absolutely have got to talk about. Not so much things about Yasuke, but other events that are talked about within Yasuke's anime that were absolutely an indictment of the times. Like, for example, within this anime, there's this sort of hint of a physical relationship between Oda Nobunaga and Danmaru Mori. Danmaru Mori was one of Oda Nobunaga's retainers, and the most that I could find about this particular guy is just he was one of Nobunaga's most devout retainers. And because of that, there's this idea that, well, they were physical lovers at one point. But the thing is that that particular aspect of history came from a non-shoku piece of literature in Edo. So for all we know, this sort of yaoi relationship between Oda Nobunaga and Danmaru Mori was possibly someone's 16th century headcanon. Now, another thing that I thought was it just kind of blew my mind when I first saw it. There is a brief blink and you'll miss it segment within the Yasuke anime that explains why there's all this futuristic tech going around Japan, despite the fact that the majority of the locations of this anime are very rural, very feudalistic, like, Sorry, so the reason why there's apparently mechs in Japan is because the Mongols brought them over. I kid you not, the reason in this anime why mechs exist in feudal Japan is because in the Mongolian invasions of 1274 and 1281, they brought mechs over. I don't think I have to tell you that this did not happen, but why I decided to isolate this particular part is that there is some truth to this. Now, hold on. I'm not advocating that there were mechs in Japan from the 1300s on, but the thing of the matter is that we have to understand, during this time, Mongolia was conquering the entirety of Asia at this point. They were pushing really far south. They had already taken over China. They had already taken Korea, and they left from Korea to Japan. to Tsushima. Thus, they had a huge amount of technology at their disposal. They had Chinese siege engines at their disposal. They had Chinese black powder at their disposal. The 1274 invasion of Japan was when the country actually saw black powder used for the first time. So, it's not really stated in any sort of historical document, but I would be very, very surprised if that during this war, Japan didn't take some of the arms and armor of Mongolia and either use it themselves or reverse engineer it and make it into basically new tech, adopting new tech. And that's kind of where I'm getting all this from. It's like, yeah, there's no mechs from Mongolia in the late 1200s coming to Japan, but there was definitely more advanced warfare technology coming into Japan that Japan was exposed to, and very likely reverse engineered into their own equipment. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is that this particular series focused on the Tensho Iga War. Now again, if you're a fan of my other channel and watch my other content, I just got done talking about the Tensho Iga Noran over there. And I've mentioned it before here and there, and I'll say it again. I always thought that the Tensho Iga Noran was an interesting piece to talk about. Like, when it comes to just Japanese media, there's movies and all different other kinds of, like, shows and things like that, and video games, too. Old video games at that deal with the Tensho Iga War, but not so much anything that comes over here, so I just thought it was a really, really interesting idea that this show focused on that. In fact, one of the big subplots when it comes to Yasuke and this Onabugeisha character, it all revolves around Iga and the Iga Tensho War and ninjas and things like that. Yeah, there are ninjas all over this particular anime too, and while their armor and tactics are definitely not what Iga were, it was still really enjoyable to watch. And like I mentioned before, there is this constant theme within this anime of old ways versus new ways. Because the thing about Nobunaga is that, like I said before, he didn't follow a lot of the old ways. He was a traditionalist to a degree. Like in this anime, he pulls in this 6-foot African slave, makes him a warrior, makes him a retainer, gives him a place of honor, and he proves himself too. Yasuke definitely proves himself. They make a point in the anime about that. And then you've got this Onabugeisha character. And again, women didn't really have much of a high place when it came to the military. In fact, Onabugeisha in general were essentially a local militia of women who defended villages while their men were off at war. That was kind of their whole thing. But again, it's this idea of Nobunaga really pushing in these new ways and pushing out these old ways that don't work anymore. And it's not even necessarily about the people that he surrounds himself with. Nobunaga took huge incentives when it came to military technology. He incorporated so many guns into his army, more so than any other daimyo had ever done at that time or leading up to that time. And Nobunaga also took huge risks, like the Battle of Okehazama. He was outnumbered against the Imagawa almost, what was it? Like 10-1? Something crazy like that? And he still won. He took a chance. Again, it's these old ways and anew. I mean, these are just the things that I really like about Oda Nobunaga, and this anime, Yasuke, really encapsulates all those things together. You know, it's not just Yasuke. I just wish that there was more time with this anime. I wish the creators just had more time to really flesh out their ideas, flesh out the characters, flesh out this chosen one idea. It's just, it all feels terribly rushed. But I mean, if you like Japanese history half as much as me, if you saw Afro Samurai and were like, man, I wish there was more of that, you need to watch this. Sit through it. Again, I know there's pacing problems. There are things that happen that don't make sense. There's a lot of instances, like I said, where we don't have to explain anything. It's magic. But try to sit through it anyway, because there are so many little things. There's still so many things that I haven't talked about yet, but I've been yammering on for like 40 minutes. I'm gonna have to pare this down a lot. But I mean, if you've seen this anime, I wanna know what you think down in the comments. Like, did you like it? Did you think the pacing was weird? Do you think the historical little footnotes were really interesting? I wanna know. But I need to go ahead and wrap it up here, or otherwise I'm gonna be talking about this for another hour. So thank you all so much for watching. Just to give you a little bit of a teaser what I'm gonna be talking about, maybe not in the next upload, maybe the next after. There is a book called the Moe Manifesto talking about Moe growing from the 1960s into the modern times, and there's a lot that I want to talk about when it comes to that book. And to top everything all off, so, you know the concept of cat girls? Did you know that they're actually a historical thing? Cat girls are legit? More on that later, but again, thank you everyone for watching, and yeah, until next time, this is Gaijin, signing out.